Hello, we're live. Well, say we, it's just me today. And you, if you're here. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers, LCPC. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very many reasons. Uh, Typically on Mondays at 1 to 2 p.m. Central Time, we always stream every week. And usually I have Caitlin Miller with me, who is another licensed therapist that works at the same practice that I work at, Effective Artistry, and Marie Moran hosting. Today, though, is a holiday in the United States and the UK, and I'm assuming many other places. It's the New Year. Happy New Year's, everyone. Uh, I I don't know. I just decided I wanted to do this today. I'm I'm working from home. Well, working from home. This is the only work I'm doing today. I'm fortunate enough to be able to spend most of the day with my family. Uh, and I don't know. I'm just going to kind of talk. I don't know if anyone's here. If you are, welcome. Good to be with you. The way that this works is it's just an open conversation. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about. Uh, those of you who are here, if you are logged into the chat through Twitch or YouTube or Facebook, whatever you put in the chat, I'll be seeing. And today's an opportunity for us to talk directly, one on one. If there's one of you here who wants to chat, build public conversation, keep that in mind. Um, this is all public, and if you are in the chat, so this video is saved as a video on demand. It can be watched later on YouTube, Twitch, or Facebook, and that includes any comments put in the chat, which will be attributed to whatever your profile name is that you're using. So if it's on YouTube, it'll be your Google account. If it's on Twitch, it's your Twitch account, and Facebook, it's your Facebook account. Keep that in mind if you're putting anything in the chat that you might not want people to know to be able to associate with your real name. Um, yeah, I run a small group therapy practice called Effective Artistry in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, family, group work with people in the state of Illinois. We also have a few executive functioning coaches who work with us. Marie, who usually hosts the show, is one of those coaches, as well as another wonderful coach named Sarah Geis. For therapy, we are only able to work with people in the state of Illinois. For coaching, we're able to work with people anywhere in the world. I remember it's been a long time since I've been the one doing the intro because Marie's been with me probably well over a year now, doing this show with me. And this today is kind of a bit of a throwback. I'm having it's an interesting thing trying to get back in the groove because there was a good long while where I did the show by myself every week, just me talking and sometimes people in the chat to talk with, which is always much more fun. But sometimes just me talking by myself for an hour, and anybody who knows me will probably not be surprised by the fact that it's not that difficult for me to talk for an hour about whatever I want to talk about. I am being a little bit quieter today because my youngest son is napping two doors down in the hall. That's part of the reason that it worked out for me to be able to do the stream at this time. Um, if my voice sounds any different, just wanted to clarify that. Today is the first day of 2024, which additions are big and anniversaries are big. A year, 365 days, and a quarter, I suppose. Uh, no, not an ASMR stream. I can't even tell. I have my earbuds in, which I don't usually wear when I'm doing the stream, so I honestly can't even tell how much quieter I am than usual. Is it significant? Um, ASMR is an interesting. I had an interesting conversation about ASMR a week or two ago, maybe. Um, anyway, yeah, I don't. I'm just going to talk about whatever I'm going to. Usually, we try to have like a topic selected. Mhm. Yeah, ASMR would be more like I think, but I'm not an expert in it. Um, yeah, a little bit of a whisper going on. Uh, Today, it's just stream of consciousness. Although I'm happy to have you here in the chat, Bast Insider, and anybody else. And as always, go in whatever direction you'd like to go in. Anything you want to talk about, I'm happy to do. But otherwise, just stream of consciousness, which is kind of my approach to a lot of this stuff generally. I have a lot of theories about communication and therapy and language and cognition and why it all works the way that it does. But stream of consciousness, I think of it like I watch NFL football. So especially my oldest son is very into it. My wife was very into it. I never paid attention to it when I was younger, but when I met my wife in 2013, she's a big Bears fan. So I started getting into it. I'm using that analogy of if you watch football or if you watch any professional sports. In football, you'll see receivers when the ball is thrown their direction, they will lay full out. They will leap and stretch out to catch the ball and will often be able to do it, even though that means that their full body is just hitting the ground, even on cold days where the ground's half frozen. And you watch that and you think, I could never do that because I couldn't. Because for me, my default response, if a ball is thrown in my direction, even if I'm thinking of it as very important to catch that ball, if if it's catchable without falling over, I'll do my best to catch it. If it's something where I could theoretically catch it by leaping and laying my body full out, that thought won't even occur to me in the space of time that that ball is headed in that direction. Even if it did, I'd have to consciously choose to do that to override my default response of not sacrificing my body. But these guys, these professional players, they do it in the blink of an eye without thinking. Same with toe tapping and all these different things. A lot about hockey and soccer playing with your D&D group. Sports is a whole interesting thing too. I guess I just have a lot of thoughts about pretty much any random thing that comes up. I think a lot. Um, the point I'm trying to make with this metaphor is that we have our default unconsidered responses to stimuli, right? That something happens and we're going to respond. We're going to do something. Sometimes that means we're just going to ignore it and move on as though it's not irrelevant to whatever we're doing and it doesn't impact us. Sometimes it modifies what we're doing, how we're feeling. And then we have the ability to consider our responses and override the default unconsidered response, the habitual response. We can consciously, what word you want to use here? I don't know. I would say choose. We can consciously choose to do something different, but that takes conscious effort, which is slow and deliberate. It's not automatic. But we can do all kinds of things to modify it so that our default unconsidered habitual response to stimuli is different, right? That even though my initial response wouldn't be to jump and lay full out and fall on the ground to catch a ball, if I do certain things in certain ways, I will train my brain and my body, my entire nervous system, so that that's the unconsidered response given the proper context, wearing pads in a game, whatever. We can change our habits, but the things that you do to change those things, you don't do them in the moment. That's why practice is important and research and learning and all these things. Go back to where I started this rambling thing of I speak very stream of consciousness. I think the best therapy, the most optimal therapy, the most optimal and efficient communication is done with unconsidered speech, that you're not consciously editing and considering everything that you're about to say in the moment, because that's very slow and very taxing. It's useful when you're trying to be precise, and especially when there's risk of uh, like danger, right? That getting a response from someone that's problematic. It's important then to be more careful and take time picking out your words. But what I and the therapists who work with me at Effective Artistry, what we focus on is doing the work in between sessions and in between conversations like this, so that when the time comes, we can speak freely and quickly and trust our intuitive responses to things and utilize them. Work really hard outside of sessions so that the sessions we don't have to consciously work very hard. But I do try to speak spontaneously. Spent a lot of time talking about what jersey might help the Sabres win if they wear. I'm trying to think of getting work done in a day as a skill that I need to practice to get better at. I have bad 8-hour workday muscles and I need to train them. Well, that's interesting. Oh, I'm hearing crying. What's this stuff? Ah, nope, there it is. That's the middle son. So the youngest is still napping, and my wife is with them for this hour. First question I would say is, what kind of work are you talking about getting done in a day? And there's a slight delay on the stream, so I'm when I ask a question, I'll just keep talking anyway, partly because there's not have silence until you have a chance to hear the question and respond to it, but also so that you don't have to respond and just keep going. But when you do respond, I'll see it and change. My guess is that you're doing what we would probably consider intellectual labor, would often be called white collar labor. Uh, the 8-hour workday, uh, the 8-hour workday is not some intrinsic thing to humans, right? This Nobody did some like vast experimental research and design to figure out what's the optimal amount of time for humans to be working. I don't know the full history of the development of the 8-hour workday. What I've heard and have not done the work to like validate this with, proper academic sources. But what I've heard is that the 8-hour workday started with Henry Ford and the assembly line. I call it a lot of reading and comprehending reports, research writing. Okay. Yeah, that's important. And I'll just skip to the part of nobody does that for 8 hours a day. That's not a thing that you can do for 8 hours a day or that a person can do for 8 hours a day. It is theoretically possible. It is possible for people to do 8 hours worth of that kind of work in a 24-hour span or even in a single stretch. A lot of us who identify as neurodivergent have hit that what we would call hyperfixation or hyperfocus or whatever, where we will work for 8 hours or even more straight. And if you do that, you pay the cost afterwards. It's it's not a sustainable amount of cognitive effort to do 8 hours in a 24-hour stretch, much less 8 hours straight. Oh, using your time effectively, that's a different thing. And you're talking about being at work physically for 8 hours, I'm assuming. Uh, and if so, let me know what you mean by use your time effectively, because that is a good question. But it does start with, I think, understanding that 8 hours engaged in intellectual labor is not a possibility. If you aim for it and you push yourself really, really hard, you can get to like 5 or 6 daily, maybe, and you'll burn out pretty rapidly if you're pushing yourself that hard. Like fairly rapidly, you'll burn out because it just isn't sustainable. There are other better ways to do this stuff, but it does depend on some specifics. Well, at least to the point where I'm satisfied that I got things done in a day. So then I'm going to ask. And if at any point you don't want me to be, as always, don't feel free not to respond to things or to change to something else or redirect me or whatever. I want to set goals at the beginning of the day and accomplish those goals. Well, that's not a bad idea by any means. And I'll give some practical suggestions of how to be helpful. But let's start with the goal setting process. When you're setting these goals, and here's a first practical thing right off the bat. I'm going to use the term aim instead of goal. There are reasons for that, and I'm going to suggest that you use the same. You're setting aims. You can use intentions if you like, but I like aims better. Goals are binary. You accomplish them or you don't. An aim, what you're aiming at, even if you don't hit it, it's not just did I hit what I was aiming at or not. It's how close did I get to what I was aiming at. And there is a big difference between almost getting there and being way off the mark. So I'm going to say aims. When you are setting those aims in the morning, what's the process you're utilizing to determine what is a reasonable aim or amount of aims to set for yourself for that day? Because here's the thing about setting aims, setting goals, setting intentions. It is very useful to organize your resources in that way, to set a conscious intention ahead of time so that all of these processes, most of which we don't really have any ability to consciously observe, but so that we're kind of guiding and directing these processes, that they are allocating resources um, in alignment with what we are consciously intending to get done, setting goals, setting intentions, setting aims, and using language to do so. Preferably not just in your head, preferably written down or spoken out loud. It's very useful. Now, having said that, what most people tend to do is they set a certain amount of goals. I'm just going to say aims from now on, goals, intentions, whatever. What most people do is they'll set aims. And then if they accomplish those aims, they feel good. And if they don't accomplish those aims, they feel as though they failed. And that makes sense based on the way that people talk about it, but it's not useful. Notice that those of us who do things in that way and feel bad and guilty about not getting enough done, don't we also tend to then not have more success feeling like we've accomplished more the next day? That no matter how much you get done, you tend to just feel as though you didn't get enough done. That whatever you did, even if it's valuable, wasn't everything you should have or could have done or as good as it could have been. The person that's setting those aims is you, and you are flawed and imperfect. You certainly can't predict the future with 100% accuracy and anticipate everything that's going to happen to you in the day. So it's kind of absurd to think that even if you had a flawless process for setting these aims, that you would somehow be able to set exactly the aims that are reasonable for you to accomplish every single day. Things will come up, things will go differently than you expect. So if you're treating these aims as goals, right? That you either check it off and feel good or you don't check it off and you feel bad. What you're doing is saying that the version of you from that morning that had less information about the day and how things would be going than the version of you that's actually trying to execute on all these things in moment to moment real time, that somehow that version of you in the morning that had less information was able to come up with a better idea of what should be happening, that the current present version of you that has more information somehow is worse than the earlier version of you that somehow set perfect goals. There's a lot of research about what I'm about to say here. Setting, like making to-do lists, is not only ineffective, it is actively harmful in a person's attempts to get more things done and be productive. To-do lists accomplish the opposite of what people are intending to use them for. And setting goals in this kind of way, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here. But really, what we're talking about is more or less a to do list, right? I'm listing out the things that I intend to get done. There's a lot of research on this. This isn't just Brandon talking. If you look at people who know much about productivity and executive functioning, hopefully they're up to date and in the know. A lot of people will talk about this. To do lists are a bad idea. Primarily, the reason that to do lists are a bad idea is because the bar to put something on that list is very, very low. So if you think, oh, I should get this done, meaning I think it would be valuable or beneficial to do this thing, then I put it on the list. There's no second question of what will it cost me or where does it fit in the priority with all the other things I'm attempting to get done and so on. So you just add more and more and more and more things to your list, more than you can get done. And if you treat it like a taskmaster, like if you don't get it all done, that means you have failed. You will always feel like you failed, which means you'll always be pushing yourself harder than you should. And you will never be resting enough, and things will get worse and worse over time. There is benefit to writing things down, but it's not in making a to-do list. I struggle with getting anything done in a workday, especially when it involves teaching myself how to do things. I just want to get like a basic amount of work done consistently in a day. Well, that's great. Like I struggle a lot with when the path forward on a task isn't clear, but I know I can do it. I just have weak muscles. I have to actually legitimately ask for clarification there because I don't know what. How can you know you can do something if how to do it isn't clear? Like by definition, that means you don't know exactly what needs to be done. So how do you know that you can do a thing that you don't know what it is that you're supposed to do? It's telling that you're using this term muscles. You used it at the very beginning twice here. I just have weak muscles, weak task doing muscles. In most executive functioning circles, what we'd be referring to here is probably task initiation, most likely, is I think what you're calling your weak task doing muscles, that you struggle with initiation. It's not a characteristic, it's not a muscle. And I know that probably sounds overly simplistic and like I'm ignoring the reality of what you mean and just being pedantic and overly focusing on the language choice. Language matters. You don't have weak task doing muscles. In fact, because we could define literally anything as a task, right? At all times, you are doing something. Sitting in a chair is doing something. It requires muscles to be activated to sit in a chair. So that right off the bat shows us that well, what we're defining as tasks, what we're defining as work, what we're defining as productivity and accomplishment really matters here. Initiation is difficult. Well, I've got a clue about part of what you're struggling with initiation, or at least part of what might bring the cost of initiation down already, is that you say you struggle, especially when the path forward on a task isn't clear. And again, I'll kind of ask, kind of state, and just let you jump in and correct me where I'm missing something or add information. What exactly do you mean when you say the path forward on a task isn't clear? Because it sounds like what you're saying is, I don't know what to do. I don't know what is the next thing I should be doing. I understand the task as a whole or the the part of the value that it serves, the reason that it is valuable to do, but I don't actually know what is the very first thing, the very next step I'm supposed to actually take action on. And if that's the case, then of course you can't initiate because you literally don't know what you're supposed to be doing. I don't know how to do a task, but I know how I can learn, if that makes sense. That doesn't make sense. So then the question would be, how can you learn? Task is nebulous. Well, that's telling us some stuff right there too, right? If you're saying you have weak task doing muscles, but if at your work I put a stack of M&Ms on your desk and said, "Hey, your job right now is to separate these M&Ms out into piles by color, one red, one blue, one green, one brown." I'm not sure what all the M&M colors are. Would you have a hard time starting that? A pile of M&Ms and M's, and all you got to do is take one and start a pile? Not at all. Right. Because it's very clear. The execution is very clear. You know exactly what to do. When you know exactly what to do, you probably don't struggle a lot with initiating on the execution of that task. There are exceptions to that, but those exceptions always fall into the category of there is something you need in order to be able to do the task that you don't have. It does sound nice if you could get paid for doing that, uh, except after the first 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, it would not feel nice anymore. But there are actually a lot of jobs you could go and get that what you're supposed to be doing is very clear. What what I what I hate that in our culture we refer to as unskilled labor. Terrible term. But generally what we mean by that is the person who is directly supervising you will tell you exactly what to do on a moment to moment basis. You're working at the fast food place, your supervisor will tell you what buttons to push and where to grab the food and whatever. That's why we call it unskilled labor. The idea being that we could replace it with anybody because you don't need to know anything about how to do it. We just need a body that can follow direction. I would do that for like 3 days if I had some good music. Well, you could do it for decades if you didn't have better options. I mean, this is what happens to people, right? That kind of briefly referenced Harry Ford there, that Henry Ford there. The whole point of his innovation was the assembly line, right? That his I doubt it was actually his initial idea, and I don't know enough about the history to know who he probably stole it from. But what he is famous for is the assembly line, the idea that if we take a complex process like building assembling a car, which to that point one person would assemble the car from beginning to end of the process, something that involves 750 steps. Teaching a person to do that process is incredibly resource intensive. They have to learn how to do each of those 750 steps, and not only how to do each one, but how to sequence and know which one happens when. That if something goes wrong in one step, how to be able to back up and figure out where it went wrong at a different. Incredibly resource intensive to train somebody to do that. And then even when we train someone to do that and they're really good at it, it's still a very inefficient way of going about doing it. What's much more efficient is to separate that into 750 different tasks and take 750 different people and teach each of those people one task to do. They don't need to know about what happens before them, and they don't need to know what happens after them. I want to keep in mind here, talking about efficiency, there are a lot of problems with this way of approaching things, but it is much more resource efficient. It's much faster, both in training people to be able to do it, but also in the actual execution of it. It also makes people interchangeable. That was the other big thing, right? Is interchangeable parts. In order for an assembly line to work, every part has to be a part that can go the same into every single model that comes down the line. And that also applies to the workers, the laborers, that it's relatively simple to train somebody to do one task. So if you lose somebody for whatever reason, it's relatively simple to replace them. Whereas if you're training somebody to build a car from beginning to end, very difficult to replace them. People do that work and they do it well and they do it for decades, for their entire adult lives. And it's meaningful and it's valuable work, and it is not cognitively challenging or interesting work. Work involves taking a project like someone is building an addition to their house and then going through a list to say, will this impact biological resources, create noise in the neighborhood, be built in a place where it's already noisy because of airplanes, will it use too much energy, create air pollution, displace an endangered species, impact archaeological resources, damage cultural resources. That sounds like a very interesting and very complex task where there are a lot of different variables. It's not exactly always clear where exactly to start. Now, I would assume, and again, this is one of those statements slash asking for clarification. I would assume that there are some processes and frameworks here because it's a task that's this complex. Typically, we have standardized it to some extent, right? That there's a checklist of things that you need to check off where generally your people aren't just going to rely on you to just remember to check everything. Do you have some kind of checklist or process or framework like that that says what's the first thing to check for? Real quick anecdote here about checklists because there the problem with to-do lists is that there is value in writing things down, including writing down tasks that you're intending to do or thinking about doing. So people will push back when we say if research is clear that to-do lists make everything worse. Because they'll say, well, I need to write it down or otherwise I'll forget. I never, I'll forget things if I don't. Yeah, that's a good reason to write things down so you don't forget them. Just don't call that a to-do list because if you call it a to-do list, it's not just a list of things to help you remember. It's a list of things that you're supposed to do. Otherwise, you've failed. Most of my senior coworkers see it as pretty rote, but it takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you know all of the resources you need. So the way you answer that question suggests that you're supposed to know what resources you need just by accessing knowledge in your head. But again, I would assume that there is some database, some way of checking, find out what resources you need. That until somebody gets to the point that, how does someone get to the point where they know all the resources they need? There are lists and databases. Great. For those lists and databases, I'm guessing again here, just based on what you're saying, aren't very well indexed, I'm assuming. And that's why you don't know exactly where to start. That when you say that you don't know what to do, but you do know how to learn what to do, I think what you mean is that you do know where all the information is. All the information you need is in these lists and these databases, but you don't know exactly how to find or identify even what necessarily you're supposed to find first. Is that right? And I'll skip ahead while waiting for a potential response or no response at all. I think hard to explain. It's like they've internalized when something will be a problem, they don't need to question it. If something is hard to explain, that's a combination of two things. I suppose it could be just one thing, but it's usually a combination of two things. One is that you don't really know how to put it into words. The other is you don't know how to put it into words that you would have a reasonable expectation that somebody else would be able to translate. In this case, likely you're trying to take something very complex that you feel as though you could explain in detail, but it would take a long time and a lot of words and sum it up into something very brief. But being able to put things into language, especially with what we're talking about here, knowing what to do first, second, third, so on, is very important. And figure out whether I had to do a historic review for a project that didn't change the building. I knew there wouldn't be an impact, but I couldn't explain why in a legally defensible way. Okay, so here's me skipping to the end for a practical solution here. You talk to somebody. Every single time you don't know exactly what to be doing next, there's a reason that you have senior coworkers. There's a reason that you have a supervisor or manager or boss or whatever the title is of the person who is positioned above you in the hierarchy of your organization. And you need to ask them. I want to say more, but I'm going to let you think for a response there before I keep going down that path. I have to ask those questions 100 times per project at the point I'm at right now. Well, if you do, then you do. There's not a way around it. And part of what you're getting stuck on, and then talking about having weak task doing muscles, is you do actually know the next step. Because when you don't know what the next executable step is, and you know that the next executable step is to ask somebody who knows or who can help you figure out what the next executable step is after asking that person. So you're not struggling to get started on things because you have bad task doing muscles. You're struggling to get started on things because you don't want to ask these people because you feel like you've been asking too much. I feel like I'm digging new trenches in my neural pathways. It's a slog. Well, I mean, there's mm, truth to that. Is really complicated and probably not necessarily. That's why I'm hesitating and trying to decide whether it's worth getting into the pedantics of neural pathways, um, and it's probably not. I'm just thinking through all this. Yeah, it is very, very resource intensive to learn how to do something new. The more complex the task is, and by complex versus simple, what I'm talking about is the amount of cognitive resources it takes to be able to figure out how to do the task. But just generally, difficult or easy something is a way of saying if it's difficult, it takes a lot of resources to do. If it's easy, it takes very few resources to do. Complex and simple is a subset of that, where the more complex something is, the more resources it takes to understand what to do, to get the idea, the knowledge of what to do. The simpler something is, the less resources it takes to know what to do. So it is possible for something to be very simple and very difficult. Pushing a car up a hill is very simple and very difficult. It takes a lot of resources, but very few of those resources are going toward figuring out what to do. Where some things, the bulk of the resources being spent is just on figuring out what to do. And once you figure out what to do, the actual execution of it is very easy. And of course, all kinds of things in between. Simple things can be difficult, complex things can't be easy. But yes, learning how to do something that's very complex is very, very difficult, which is why it requires a lot of training and support. And I would assume that the people in your organization understand that Training somebody to do this complicated task is something that takes a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of effort over time, not just once, and that people will have to ask the same questions over and over and over and over. You're not struggling to initiate, you're struggling to get yourself to ask for help. Can you name any task that you're attempting to do that you're struggling to initiate on at work where you know exactly what steps to take other than a step where it's go ask for somebody's help or knowledge? New job takes a lot of effort. Like I'm trying to walk through a lot of freshly fallen snow. I have to keep walking that path to wear down the snow to the point where I can do it without this much effort. Yeah, I like that metaphor. And again, that's with all new things. Anything which is new is difficult. Nope, so all my coworkers are out of the office right now. Yeah, that sounds like it would complicate things, as well as a bunch of other things that may or may not be true of you. Things like sometimes people have really progress on tasks without them. Quick practical thing, I would suggest that you refrain from using the word need unless you pair that with in order to. I need to make progress on tasks without them, or else what? Or in order to what? Otherwise, I would suggest that you use language like it would be beneficial or valuable, or I have been asked to, or well, now that's just recursive. I need to make progress on tasks without them in order to make progress. I mean, what happens if you don't make progress on tasks without them? Uh, Sometimes the people who are responsible for training and supporting you as you're learning something new are not very interested in doing that. Sometimes those people get annoyed when they get asked a question, especially if it's a question they've already feel like they've answered. But sometimes people get annoyed being asked a question of any kind. But that is something to weigh in. I'm not going to pretend like every situation is a great situation where the people in charge know what they should be doing. But anybody who knows what they're doing will say that they would much rather that you come to them and ask them, no matter how many times it takes, rather than sit there and not get anything done because you're afraid to ask. That if you don't know what to do, that they would rather be able to get you clear and specific instructions rather than having you try to figure it out and guess on your own and potentially get something wrong. For an organization, for a community, it is always, always better that if someone doesn't know exactly what to do next, they go and ask somebody for help with figuring out what to do next. I want to show that I've been spending time on these tasks. They're also due not long after people come back into the office. I just want to go through the list and do what I can and make notes of all the questions I have. Well, that's great. You can do that. Every time you don't know what to do, you say you have a list of questions, right? You work on a task, doing what you know what to do until you get to the point where you don't know exactly what to do next. And then you write that down as a question. In fact, I would assume because most places have this now that there's some form of asynchronous written communication, a Slack, Microsoft Teams, a GChat kind of thing. Uh, and I would suggest that when you come to a question, you just send that question to the person that you would ask the question to, even though they're out. You can put a disclaimer at the top saying, hey, I know you're out. I'm not expecting a response to this, but as I'm working on things, I'm just going to put the questions I have here so that I don't forget them for later, which will accomplish showing everybody that you've been working on these things while they've been out of the office, like you're wanting to do, that you've been spending time on these tasks. And maybe people can respond to you and maybe not. I have been out of the office for the most part last week, but I still have time here and there where I can check messages and respond to them. I've made it clear to everyone not to expect that and to know that, you know, if I don't choose to do it, I don't need to feel stressed about it. It's a complicated task. It's hydrophobic to my brain. I wonder if that's an autocorrect or what you might mean by hydrophobic. That would mean afraid of water. I don't know if I'm missing some usage of that term, some like cultural usage of it, or Um, there is no magic way for you to be able to figure out an answer to a question that you don't know the answer to. So you either put the question to other people, or you can do what I think it sounds like what you're thinking you should be doing or intending to do, where you're pouring through the database to try and find answers. Uh, which you're struggling with that because, okay, this would be like if I said to somebody, hey, I need to, my car's broken, I need to fix it. And they were to say, well, you can find out anything you need to find out on the internet, which is true, right? That no matter what car I'm talking about and no matter what the problem is, theoretically, the information exists on the internet to be able to help me figure out how to solve that problem. Oh, I see. Hydrophobic is in it repels water and you're trying to get it wet. It's repelling you. Uh, whatever the equivalent to hydrophobic is to brain doing. I like that. Okay. So I didn't know that hydrophobic meant water repellent, which is interesting to know. Um, okay, what you're talking about then is I am trying to cognitively accomplish a task that is not getting accomplished through my cognitive efforts. I think that's what you mean when you're saying that it's repelling your attempts to solve it, to get your brain to do it. It's important to note that thinking and acting are two different things. So you thinking about the task and trying to figure out how to get the task done is effort that you are putting in towards accomplishing the task, but it isn't action and therefore is not observable, which it sounds like it's something that you're concerned about here, that you're worried that people will think you haven't been doing anything when you've actually been spending a lot of resources trying to figure it out, but you don't really have anything to show for that because you haven't figured out what to physically observably do that results in observable progress for people. And that fairy glamour that works by making people's eyes slide over them. It seems, and I don't know a lot of detail here, obviously, but it seems like you are resistant to the idea that you just don't know how to do this. You keep saying you know basically what to do. I don't know what to do, but I know how to learn what to do, right? That you actually, when it comes to, if I were to tell somebody to make a grilled cheese sandwich, I could lay that out in step by steps. And depending on the knowledge that that person already has, I can do it in very few generic steps, like, okay, put a pan on the stove, heat it up, butter some bread, put the butter side down, put some cheese on the other side, butter another piece of bread, put it on top of the cheese with the butter side up, and then at a certain point, flip, right? Like that's relatively few steps. But in order for that to be executable, even though I could tell someone that and they could repeat it back to me, right? I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to put a pan on the stove and heat it up and get butter, blah, blah, blah. If they don't know what a pan is, that's not going to work so well. They do know what a pan is, but they don't know where the pans are in this kitchen. That's not going to work so well. They don't know how to operate this particular stove. Or when I say heat it up and they don't know exactly what that means in terms of how hot to make it. Feels like you're trying to do pull-ups when you don't have the muscles for pull-ups. No, I do understand that part, and what I'm trying to say is that that way of thinking about this is part of what's getting in your way. You're treating it as though it is something that you know how to do, but cannot do. Like trying to do pull-ups when you don't have muscle for the pull-ups. You know how to do a pull-up, you know what to do, you just aren't capable of executing it, right? Your muscles aren't strong enough. You know, if I go through the list and check the resources they've given me, I can learn how to do the task. True, the same way that I can learn how to fix a car by utilizing information on the internet. That that's not very actionable, right? Like Does the list have a first thing? The list that you're working off, does it say, first thing, do this? What's the first item on that list? Or is it a category like, you know, on this list is check to make sure if there's any historical whatever. Okay. So that's not actionable. It's a category was the answer there. I'm reading it out just in case anybody's not looking at the chat when they're watching this or later. Uh, it's a category. That's not actionable. Like if they will impact air quality. Great. My wife likes to watch the Great British Baking Show, Great British Bake Off. I forget what exactly it's called. Uh, and as part of it, they do what they call technical challenges, where they give a list of instructions to make a specific thing, to bake a specific thing. And each of these people are expert bakers. Obviously, they wouldn't be on the show, and the other things they make when they get control over the recipes are just phenomenal. And the oh no, it's called both. Uh, the point of this technical challenge is that they are deliberately doing what they can to give as minimal of information as possible on how to execute the task while still theoretically giving enough to be able to execute the task. So sometimes the direction will say something like make the batter, which if you know what it is you're making and have experience making it, that can be relatively simple. If you don't, you even though you have a general knowledge of how to make batter, what ingredients go into it at what ratio, well, there's a lot of different kinds of batter. Do you want the ratio of flour to eggs to be bigger or smaller? Do you want to mix it thoroughly or leave it kind of I don't know anything about batter. uh, but the point is that they give intentionally vague directions. Check to see if it will impact air quality is very vague directions. Now, you presumably have some knowledge and experience in this area, just like the people on the show do with baking. And so you have some expectation that other people have an expectation that you should be able to do it with that minimal of instruction. The point of the show, by the way, is that they're deliberately giving fewer instructions than they think are necessary to people because not a very interesting show if everybody nails every single thing all the time. It's also why they give way less time than is actually necessary for people to be able to do their bakes, right? This is not the show. You're not being tested. This isn't for you to produce a product that then is ranked and compared in a competition against other people to see if you're getting sent home this week. The people who are assigning you this task theoretically are invested in the task being done well, properly, right? Thoroughly. They're not trying to test you. So you have some information on how to check if it will impact air quality, presumably, or you wouldn't be in this role. Presumably, you have some information about that. You don't have all of the information about it. Even if you had been doing this for 40 years, you don't have all the information on how to do it exactly at this new place, right? That when I hire a therapist, even if they're been doing therapy for decades, they don't know how our policies and procedures work. I still will need to train them on how to use simple practice and, you know, how we communicate through the G chat. You don't have all the information, you have some. And so you ask for the information you don't have. You ask for clarity. They should want that. They should want you to be asking. I would bet that if you think about it, they have probably said to you, if you don't know what to do, here's how you ask, right? Send me a message or go to this person or whatever. I would bet that they've probably said, whenever you come across something that you're not exactly sure, just let me know and I'll help you through it. And it's quite likely that you heard that and immediately dismissed that as an empty offer. That sure they say that, but actually they'll be upset if I do. You may not have a lot of trouble asking for help generally. You are having trouble asking for this specific kind of help because you said earlier that the other people you work with know how to do this stuff. And what we keep coming back to is the reason that you're struggling to do these things is because you don't know exactly what to do. What's the next executable step? right? My little metaphor earlier about making grilled cheese. If I say, put the pan on and turn up the heat, well, you might be a person who knows enough about heat and baking and cooking, whatever, to think, okay, well, it doesn't necessarily really matter what heat I use. If I put it up higher, it'll cook faster. If it's lower, it'll cook slower. And based on what I'm trying to accomplish, faster is better or slower is better, or it doesn't really matter or whatever. Or you may be somebody who doesn't know all that, and for all you know, what heat to put it on is very important. I say turn up the heat, and you look at the knob, and there's 10 different settings, and you don't know which one I meant. Well, that makes it very hard for you to do it. One of the things you mentioned earlier about I don't know if I need to do what I need to do to check if it will have a historical or impact historical value when they're not changing the building is an example of that, right? You know the answer, but you don't know if you know exactly what they want. You don't know what exactly they're going to want you to do to justify the answer being that there's no concern here. You could just write no concerns here. Your concern is that if you do that, they will say, well, you were supposed to do something to check that and not just make the claim. Especially when it's that kind of task, there legitimately is nothing to do except to find out what they want you to do. It's possible that in the writing that you have access to, the lists and databases, that they have listed exactly somewhere in there what exactly they want you to do. I think I would learn a lot better and without as much effort if I could help my supervisor on her work doing smaller tasks on a project that they have context for. I can learn smaller things little by little. Yeah, maybe. But of all at once with the starting projects they give us. Well, maybe. I mean, it's quite possible. It depends on a lot of variables, but certainly it is easier to learn a small, simple task than it is to learn a large, complex task. And so what you're saying is, it sounds like that you would have liked the opportunity to learn a bunch of small, simple tasks rather than a big, complex task, which incorporates all of those small, simple tasks. Now, again, this works how it works, whether you like it or not, and whether your supervisor likes it or not. Learning how to do things works the way that it works. And you are trying to learn not only how to do each individual task, but also how to sequence those tasks. You're learning, let's say, just for the sake of illustration, that there are 500 actionable steps you need to take here. Well, then you need to learn each of those 500 steps, although likely you already know how to do a lot of those, which is part of what's qualified you for this job in the first place. But you also need to know how those 500 steps impact one another, how to sequence them with one another, right? And it sounds like that's the part that you're struggling with, is what you're trying to say is, I know most of the 500 tasks. I know how to do most of the 500 tasks. What you're struggling with is you're not sure which of those tasks to do first, or that some of those tasks, like if I, again, were to say something to a therapist I've hired about, okay, make sure that you enter the session and submit the insurance claim. That might be something that they know how to do, but they don't know how to do it on our software, right? That there are tasks you might know how to do, but that the specific way that this particular organization needs you to do them or wants you to do them is not something you have experience with. I think it is worth noting that you seem very resistant to the idea, resistant, I don't like the word, hesitant. You seem to not like the idea of just asking your supervisor what to do next or one of your coworkers what to do next. Part of the reason for that, you already said, is that people are out of the office and you don't want to wait on them, which makes sense, but you still do it anyway. My wife and I will argue about this particular thing where if I'm looking for something in our house, I'll look for it. And as I am looking for it, I will call out to her and say, hey, Susan, do you know where such and such is? And sometimes she'll get very frustrated or annoyed with that because she's interpreting the question as though I'm saying, I'm not going to look for it. I'm just expecting you to know where it is and to tell me where it is before I look for it. Where What I'm doing is, no, I am looking for it. And if it so happens that you already have the information, it will be much more efficient for you to tell me where it is. I don't expect you to have an answer to the question. I'm just throwing it out to you because if you happen to know, then I can skip the looking for it. If you don't, I'm going to keep looking for it as I already am. Either way is fine, right? That's the case here. That you're going to be looking for these answers on your own, one way or another, right? I'm not saying don't do that, especially while you're waiting for people who are out of the company. Ideally, I would go through the list first and make notes of all my questions so my supervisor and I can go over it together. Sure. And there might be reasons that you can let me know or not about why you would prefer to do it that way. But I'll point out that that's not the most efficient. In fact, that's exactly what you were just saying about you'd rather have an opportunity to go through things one by one at a time, learn this small task, rather than try and learn it all at once. For the person who's trying to teach you, it'll also be a lot simpler and more efficient to have this is your question, let me answer it. This is your question, let me answer it, rather than let's sit down and go over 60 questions all at the same time. It takes a lot of effort for me to go through the list because it's a big, complicated task. Sure. The more difficult something is, the more resources it takes. I use effort just so that you know, because I think this is a useful way. I use the word effort to refer to a particular resource. I was referring earlier to we have our default unconsidered responses, right? That without thinking consciously about what to do or putting conscious intention to what to do, we will still do something, even if what we're doing is sitting in a chair or whatever, right? We have an ability to consciously consider what to do and override that default response with the new conscious idea. We have a very limited ability to do that. It's a finite ability. You can only do that so much. Override default response is a difficult thing to do. Like a very simple version of this is if there's some food you love, say that you love cookies, but you're trying not to eat them because you think that the sugar's bad for you, and you're sitting there in front of a cookie looking at it, your default response, your impulse is to pick it up and eat it, right? But you're using resources to override that and say, no, I'm not going to have that. But if you sit there looking at that cookie, every moment you're spending resources to override that default impulse to eat the cookie. Eventually, sooner or later, you run out of the resources necessary to override that impulse and you'll eat the cookie. It might take 5 minutes, it might take 3 hours, it might take 5 days, unlikely, but eventually you'll do it. You'll stop being able to override the default impulse. That resource I call effort. That's what I use effort for. When I say something is effortful, I mean it. You have to consciously override your default impulse. I'm just clarifying that because I think it's a useful way. I think what you mean by effort is just larger. It's costly. You're spending a lot of resources on it. Harder for them to continue with their work if they keep getting interrupted. Entire work is effortful right now. Well, that's part of why I'm clarifying my use of effort is because yes, the first time you are doing something, if it's important to do it correctly or in a particular way, it is effortful. You can't rely on, as you keep saying here, right? You can't rely on default impulses, like I was talking about earlier. It takes work in between the actual moments of execution to shape yourself into someone where your default unconsidered response in the actual moment of execution is the one that you would want it to be. Can't do it at first. That's just not how this works. That there's no magic way to do that. If you're doing 8 hours a day of effort, well, first of all, I'll say you're not. There's no way. You can't actually consciously override your behavior and your default impulses for 8 hours a day. So what's probably happening is you're trying to do 8 hours a day, but you're doing some amount less than that, and then feeling very bad about the fact that you're not doing 8 hours worth of it, which means you're pushing yourself as hard as you can push yourself, which slows down the speed at which you learn. Another way of saying, like, okay, you use the example earlier, the metaphor of it's like trying to do a pull up, but I don't have the muscles to do it. My muscles are too weak to do it. Is a great metaphor for this particular aspect of it. If I'm trying to do a pull up and I can't, but I try as best I can in like lifting and whatever they call that, the point of failure, where no matter how hard you're trying, your muscles literally just cannot accomplish that task. And you can do, you know, you can get as far as you can get and can't go anymore, and then you're gonna fail, right? In working out, in lifting, when you reach the point of failure, you stop. Because if you continue to try again, even if you rest for 5 or 10 minutes and then try it again, you're not increasing the benefit you're getting out of what you're doing. You're just going to injure yourself and make it so that you can't do it again the next day. When you reach the point of failure, you stop. Try to start with just progress. I'm telling myself I can get through 3 items on the list in a day, but it takes a ton of effort to even start. Well, again, I'm going to guess that the items on the list are not actionable. And as I'm saying with the grilled cheese example, what is actionable does depend on the person. If I say clean this room, if it's your bedroom and you know where everything goes and you know what I mean by clean and how to get things squared away to the standards that I would accept as being clean, then that's all I need to say and you can do it. If I see clean this room and it's a room you've never been in before and there's a bunch of stuff that needs to be put away, then that's not actionable, right? You don't know where the clothes need to go or what exactly I mean. Even if you do your best to just start, because this is effectively what you're doing, right? Is you're in a room you've never been in before and you've been told to clean it. And you're like, I know basically how to clean a room. I know clothes get folded and put away. And I know blah, 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 right? Like I know that books go on shelves. I don't know if these books go on these shelves or if they do exactly where. But you can sit in there and you can do it. You can say, well, I know how to fold some clothes. I'm going to fold them. I'm going to put them on the shelf. And you can do that. But then after you do that, you're still going to think, I don't know if this is clean or not. I don't know if when they come in here, they're going to want these on a different shelf. And if you're nervous for whatever reason about asking me because you don't want to interrupt me doing my work, for example, then it's going to be very hard for you at any point to say, I'm done. No matter if you think it's clean, well, you're not doing it because you wanted to clean it. You're doing it because I asked you to. And you don't know exactly what's my criteria for the task being complete, but you don't want to have me come check it until you feel as though it is complete. But you can't know what my criteria is without me telling you. And yes, sometimes people will be, you'll say, What exactly do you mean by clean? And they'll say, clean it, just clean it. What are you talking about? Just, it's not that complicated. Clean the room. Because sometimes people are like that. But if they're any good at their job, they won't be. You're saying you don't want to interrupt your supervisor's work. Well, your supervisor's work includes supervising you, right? Like that's an important part of their work. And you're going to cause them a lot more problems if you don't get what you're if they've assigned you some task and you don't know how to do it and you don't get it done, but you also don't tell them that you don't know how to do it and that you're struggling to get it done, that's going to be a much bigger problem than you interrupting them to ask for clarification. Or if you just try and do your best guesses to get it done, but you end up doing it in some way that's different than what it is that they are expecting or wanting to happen, meaning that you've made some mistake, that's going to cause a much bigger problem than getting asked. Any supervisor who's any good at what they do would always, always, always want one of their supervisees to ask when they don't know what to do rather than to try and figure it out on their own. Again, people are people and they're flawed and they're limited, and even good ones. I think of myself as a good supervisor, and there are probably still times where if someone were to ask me something, I would get irritated. I'm sure there have been times, I can't think of any specific examples, but I'm sure that there are times, even if I do, I'm still going to answer the question because what else is going to happen? They don't know how to do it, and the task needs to be done. So either it goes undone or they make their guesses and maybe do it, and maybe either way, I still need to talk to them and help them understand. If I don't answer, then I'm going to have to check the work afterwards, and that's more effortful than just teaching them how to do it right then and there. Intelligent people and people who do intellectual labor, the kind of work you're talking about, are pretty much by definition intelligent people by the meaning of the word intelligent that I utilize, meaning people who think to solve problems, people whose response to a problem is to utilize the cognitive environment in order to try and come up with a solution. We construct solution attempts in our head and then think it through. Will that work? No. What about this? Will that work? No. What about this? Will that work? No. Which is what you're doing. We do have a tendency to not define things in actionable ways. In our culture, intelligence is mostly defined by speed and independence. That if you do a task quickly and without any help, we say you're intelligent. That's not a very effective way to run an organization. Speed and independence are great, but getting it done correctly is more important than either of those things. So when it comes to the point where I can get it done fast but incorrectly, or I can get it done independently but incorrectly, or I can get it done correctly but it won't be independent or it won't be fast, I want it done correctly. The old saying of measure twice, cut once, right? If you try and do this on your own, then you'll submit something at the end that they'll have to look over, and anything that you did incorrectly, they'll come and talk to you and have you fix it or support you in fixing it then. There isn't an option for you to do this that doesn't require that they look over your work. So it's just more efficient, more effective to do that while you're doing the task instead of after the fact. An item on a list which isn't actionable, like a categorical thing like check if it will impact air quality, needs to be translated into an actionable plan first. Oh, I have a framework for this. It's been a long time since I've used this. Uh, OATOM, not the full thing though. I, I've been trying to come up with better and easier to remember mnemonic and whatever, but for now, OATOM is the framework that I have used and taught people for this. First O is observation, aim, theory, operation, and measure. The first observation is you observe what is there. In this case, you have been assigned a task, you have a list of things that you're supposed to go through in order to do it, whatever, whatever. But the task itself is not accomplished. The report or whatever that you're supposed to write up hasn't been written up. Second is the aim. What is it that you would prefer be happening to the observation? In this case, that the report is done. That's what you're aiming at. We can kind of skip over those ones quickly. They come into play more with different types of things. That third step, theory, is what do I think needs to be done in order for for the observation to become the aim? And that's where you're at right now. You're trying to think about what needs to be done to get from where you're at to where you're trying to be. That step, that theory step, that's where the variation comes in, right? That, like I said, I can say put it on heat on the stove, and that can be operational. I mean, that can be actionable for you depending on how you use language and how you know me and what I use language and blah blah blah. Or it can be still too vague to actually be actionable, and you need to break it down further. So, as an example, I know I need to do this report, and the theory that you came up with is I need to improve my task doing muscles. I need to improve my initiation, right? That if I get better at doing things, just generally doing any kind of a productive thing, then I will be able to do this report. That's a fine theory to have. And then you got to operationalize it. That's the next one, operationalize it. Turn your theory into an operational, which means turn it into a series of actionable steps. That step one is clear and specific enough that it can be done. It doesn't need to be figured out or understood. It can just be done. And yes, that can be butter some bread, or it can be get a knife out of the drawer, find the butter and put it out on the counter, get a piece of bread from the right. Like we can whatever's actionable depends on the specific individual and the context. But once you designing the operation is a series of actionable steps. No more figuring stuff out. Step one of the operation can't be figure out how to determine whether it's going to impact air quality or not. That's still back in theory. So if your theory is I need to get better at doing stuff generally, great. And then operationalize it, turn it into a series of actionable steps. If you can't, it doesn't matter whether the theory is a good one or not. It might be. Maybe if you were better at initiating and doing things generally, this wouldn't be an issue. That's entirely possible. But if you can't operationalize it, you can't do anything about it. So you need a different theory then, or you need support because the operation you operationalize things without making a to-do list. That's a good question. And I'll try and address it quickly. I was starting to talk about this earlier. Writing things down is very useful for three different reasons. I mean, writing things down that you intend to do or think you should do or would be beneficial to do is very valuable for three different reasons. What we mean when we say don't use a to-do list is don't make it a list of things that you have to get done or else you failed, right? That you're supposed to do it, have to do it, need to do it. That if you don't get everything done on that list, you're stressing out or feeling bad. That's what makes it a problem. The three things that writing things down with helps with, number one, is remembering things. It's right. It's offloading the specifics of something from having to retain it in working memory or encode it for retrieval from long-term memory onto just all you have to remember now is where you've written it down. So that could be very helpful. Depends on the thing you're doing. Another is that it can help you organize information. And that's a lot of what we're talking about right here is if I know, for example, I need to fix the car, I can't, even if I know a lot about fixing cars, right? Even if I theoretically am able to do all this and have the knowledge that I need, I can't hold all of that step by step information in my head in working memory. There's not enough room for it. And spending any of my working memory space on trying to remember the sequence of events uh, would be a waste and decrease my ability to do whatever I'm trying to do efficiently. So instead, I just hold a vague thing of fix the car. In order to actually make any progress on that, I first have to organize that by expanding that out into what exactly does fix the car mean. In essence, fix the car is a placeholder to remind me to do some larger thing, and I need to do that larger thing. Sometimes organizing things, it's like I've got a bunch of stuff, but if I can write it all down, I can realize that, oh, these seven things basically are this one category of thing. But sometimes it's about condensing things. Sometimes, like I said, it's the opposite. This one thing is actually 20 different things and expanding things. Sometimes it's sequencing things. Like in this case, I know here's 50 different things I need to do. I know, but if I write it all down, then I have the space to be able to put them in sequential order instead of just having them randomly kind of pop into my head. And then the third is what I call clearing the cache, which is really just a version of organizing things, but it's a particular one. A lot of the time you're trying to carry around so much stuff in working memory that you don't have the available room in working memory to evaluate whether any of those things are actually worth carrying around or not. In essence, it's like you had to run away from your desk real fast. So you just grabbed everything on your desk because you didn't have the time to sort through which things you're actually going to need or not. But then writing things down in that case would be like setting all those things out and now taking the time to say, oh, I actually don't need this and this I do need and that I don't need. That's what clearing the cache is for me. It's journaling is a version of that. Even therapy is often involves versions of that. I think should optimally involve some of that, at least in every session, where you're just kind of finally expanding. You've got so many things reduced down to such small placeholders that to expand one and actually see, do I need this? No, I can get. This is a lot of what happens when people will say like, being voice in the back of my head is I've expanded a bunch of things down so much that some of that stuff is just I have to do something. That's all I've been able to retain, and I have to like re-expand and figure out what it is I'm supposed to do when it's time. Determine long-term to-do list in my notebook. I rewrite it out every week, so every time I rewrite them, I have to make a decision if it's worth keeping on the list. Do I want to do this task enough that it's worth writing it down again every week? That's fine. That's fine. The way to make that more so the generic kind of advice for replacing the to-do list is to do what's called time blocking. That's what most like anyone who's an expert on productivity and whatever, the default generic recommendation to replace a to-do list is time blocking, which means rather than a to-do list, you keep a calendar of, hourly, whatever, hour by hour calendar. And that instead of putting something on your to-do list, whenever you would put it on your to-do list, instead you go to your calendar, you'd make a decision about how much time you need to block out in order to get this task done, and you put it directly into your calendar for the time that you're intending to do it. I recommend something even more nuanced than that, but that's the generic version. And that's really helpful because it makes you consider what a thing costs, not just what value it has. What you're talking about in is it worth writing it down again? The only cost you're considering is it worth spending the time and energy to write it down again? But the actual cost you should be considering is what will it cost you to do the task? And is it worth that? That, okay, yes, it would be good for me to uh, work out today. And then you think, okay, what time and what energy will it take for me to do that? And you try and slot it into your day, given all the other things that you've already slotted into your day. If it doesn't fit, you say, well, that's not happening today. Or if it doesn't fit, you have to find something else that you intended to do that day that you have to then cut and bump to tomorrow or just cut completely in order to make room for the new task. It's important to consider how much something will cost you, not just how valuable it is. The reason that I don't recommend time blocking, even though it's a nice, like, generic thing to do for sure, is that it still tends to get treated the same as a to-do list where, okay, I've set the time aside to do these things. And once the time rolls around, if I do it, I feel good. But if I don't, now I'm bad. Oh no, I didn't do this thing. What's wrong with me? Why can't I get myself to do it? I have the time. I set the time aside, blah, blah, blah. And that has the same problem as a to-do list. It doesn't happen as much because you're now considering how much time something takes, and therefore there's a much higher bar to put something into your calendar than there is to add something to your to-do list. But the big problem is that time is not a resource. You can't conserve it. You can't spend it at a faster rate. You can't recoup it, regenerate it. It's not something you can manage. When we say I'm struggling with time management, the thing that you're actually managing is your behavior, right? I'm just it literally it would be like saying I'm struggling with space management. Space is not a resource. It's just a thing which exists in which we move through. You don't possess it or have any ability to manipulate it. You just move through it, which means that setting the time aside, even though that's better because now you're considering some cost at least, isn't the thing. So sometimes the time will roll around and you'll have the time free to do it and you still won't be able to do it. And then you're back to what's wrong with me. Energy, there's many resources, but energy is universal, right? Like anything you do involves some energy and it gets complicated because there's different kinds of energy and blah, blah, blah. And none of this is definitive. That's why we focus on time. It's easy to talk about time. We all know what an hour is. I have a million clocks to tell me how long time, you know, how long something's taken or whatever. Energy, how do I measure that? How do I measure exactly how much energy something takes me? And even if I can measure things, how do I communicate to you like, okay, well, that's going to take me 20 points of energy. That means nothing to, there's a reason we don't talk about it, even though it's the one that's much more impactful. Anyway, I won't keep going on about that because we're 20 minutes long and I should get going soon. Um, Coming up with a theory of how to solve the problem is something that you are likely very good at. Sometimes those theories are easy to operationalize, sometimes they're not. What's happening here is that you're struggling with a theory that you can't operationalize, but you're thinking of it as an operation that you're struggling to execute. But for example, if I'm tired and my theory of how I'll be less tired is I'll go to, yeah, 200 joules. Uh, my theory about how to be less tired is that I'll go to bed earlier tonight. I can I can operationalize that theory, right? I can say, okay, at 10 p.m. I will turn off the TV and go to the bedroom and be in my bed and blah 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 blah. And then when 10 o'clock rolls around, I might not execute that operation. And that's when we're going to look at, okay, what are the resources that I need to be able to execute this that I don't have? How do I either work tomorrow to make sure that I still have those resources at that time of day? Or what do I do in this moment now to regenerate, recover some of those resources so that I can do it as soon as possible? But if my theory is just, I need to sleep better, and then I say, okay, well, how do I sleep better? I don't know. I just try to sleep better. That's not an operation. So how you deal with a theory that you're struggling to operationalize is different from how you deal with an operation that you're struggling to execute. You're treating this like it's an operation you're struggling to execute, but it's actually a theory you're struggling to operationalize. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. You cannot execute something which isn't actionable. That's the definition of what actionable means. It means that it is a thing which action can be taken on, which can be put into action. If you don't have things if you don't have either listed out or in your head an actionable operation, an actionable understanding of what is your next step to do, then the only thing you can do next is try to figure out what that next step is. So now you're on a new theory and a new operation. Now it is the operation of learning what to do in order to make that initial thing actionable and execute on it. If you're talking about learning, there's only two ways that humans can get information. One is through direct personal experience, the other is through communication with other humans. For for these purposes, things that people have written is still communication with other humans, right? You're getting information through language that other humans have conveyed to you in some way. So sometimes it's something where you do trial and error. You just try a thing, and through the experience of it, you get information and you can iterate from there. Sometimes it's a thing where so like looking for something, that's direct personal experience. I'm saying, is it here? Is it here? No. Is it here? Is it here? No, no, no. Learning by getting information from other humans is where I'm saying, hey, do you know where this thing is? And if they do and they tell me, then I can translate that into something which directs my actions to look in this other place, in the specific place I was just directed to. It sounds like you're trying to figure out how to do this one through your own direct experience, like just trying stuff. But your idea is, I just got to try some stuff and see how it goes. And I don't know enough about the specifics of what you're doing to know if that's actually possible here, but it seems like it's not. It seems like this isn't something that you can just try and then observe the result and determine whether the result was successful or not, because the way that you determine whether the result was successful is by submitting it to somebody else for feedback. So you can try and use trial and error, but the only way you'd know if it's an error or a success is to go to somebody else at that point anyway. So it's just a matter of whether you try it before going to someone else or not. So in this case, you're focused in on trying to learn from other people, and you want to learn from the things that they have written rather than from talking to them directly. There are advantages to each of those ways, and you've already identified a lot of them, right? That the advantages of learning something from writing, from something someone's written rather than from talking to them directly, is that the other person does not have to, that if they've already written it, it's written and it requires no further resources on their part. You're just referencing something they've already created. It requires no direct access to them. It doesn't require them to spend any resources of any kind. Another one of the advantages of looking at something that somebody's written is that you can take your time and you can reread it and go back and forth and make your own notes, and you can use that writing as many times as much as you want. Whereas talking to somebody, you only have so much time that you're talking with them. The advantage of talking with somebody instead of looking at whatever they've written is indexing. That when a part of what you're struggling with is figuring out, even though I know the information I need is on the internet, I don't know how to get that particular information. I don't know how to find that. I understand that my car making a weird noise happens for a reason, and that the information exists on the internet to help me diagnose the problem and repair the problem. But I don't know how to type into Google like my car sounds like ugh, 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 ugh. I don't know how to utilize even something as thoroughly indexed as the internet. I just can't use it to find the information that I need. So yeah, maybe they have stuff like that. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an app that you can like hold up to your car and it hears the sound. And if there's not, there you go. There's an app idea for some like mechanic slash programmer. Um, and that sounds like it's where you're stuck right now. Is that the information exists in these databases. The databases might even be well indexed, but you don't have the ability for whatever reason to be able to identify either what information you're needing to find in order to be able to use the indexing to get to that information, or yeah, right. Uh, or if you do know what information you're looking for, you don't know how to utilize the way that the information is indexed in order to get to that information. One of those two things. And so instead, you're brute forcing it, where you're saying, well, I'll just read it all, and that way I'll find it. And that won't work because you can't. That's like reading the encyclopedia to learn about the Civil War. Like, does the information exist in there? Yes. If you read the entire thing, will you get to the information that you're looking for? Yes, eventually. But reading and comprehending that stuff is a very draining task. You can't do it all at once. So you could just start at the beginning and start reading through it, and you'll get maybe a few pages worth of good information before you just can't keep going anymore. There's reasons for this. And this is probably part of what you're referring to as having weak doing things muscles, because what then happens is that on some level, in some language, you can't just read the entire database and get the information you're looking for. That to learn it that way, brute forcing it would take months of effort. And so instead, you're going back to theory. I got to figure out how to figure this out without doing it that way. And you're not coming up with another theory that's operationalizable. You're not coming up with another theory of something you can do, put into action. So then you come bounce back to, well, if I just go through the whole thing, I'll figure it out. But you can't actually execute that, not because you're deficient, but because nobody could do it that way. That's not how it's intended to be done. It's a reference text, these things that you're using, I'm guessing. And if it was meant for you to be utilizing in lieu of talking to somebody else, then it should be organized in an actionable way. Step one, do this thing. Step two, do this thing. If it's not that, if it's just categorized, indexed, but by category, then it's meant as a reference after somebody has taught you how to do it. So you're ping ponging back and forth between, I just need to brute force it and learn it all that way, but that's not going to work. So then you go back to trying to figure out another way to do it without doing it that way, and you can't come up with anything. So then you go back to, well, I just need to brute force it then. But I got to find out. I got to brute force it, and I think that's the point you're stuck at, where you're calling it having weak doing things muscles. Get task doing muscles. It feels to you like you know what to do, brute force it, but you can't get yourself to do it. And because you likely identify as neurodivergent, it's quite likely that you think of yourself as being deficient in being able to read and comprehend and get language or get information through written language that way. So you might be stuck in part because you're saying, well, other people could just brute force read their way through this and figure it out. And I just can't get myself to pay attention enough, whatever. But no, that's not how it works. There is individual variation, one person to the next, of how costly it is and how many resources you have available to spend, how much you can get from written, how much information you can get from written words in a particular period of time. But when it's unindexed, it's very, very inefficient and very limited for everybody. Nobody could learn it that way in a day or two or a week or whatever, like these databases. It gets much more efficient if you can target, okay, I'm doing a thing, I'm at a point where I need a specific answer to a specific thing, and then I get it, and then I go back. That works great. But if you're not doing that, then it's really just not doable this way. So I would go back to messaging your supervisor or your colleagues whenever you have a question and just say, I understand you're out of the office, or I know you're busy. I'm going to just put questions here when I come to them. I don't expect you to respond to them. And if you'd want to meet and just kind of go over them all together at once, we can do that. But I'm just going to put them here as a way of like keeping track of the questions that I have as I go along. That way they'll know you're working. That way it will accomplish what you're already talking about, where you're saying, I just need to go through and make notes of all my questions. The reason you're struggling with that most likely is because you're doing it in this abstract way where you're trying to read the list, anticipate what all your questions would be. But a lot of the things you're going to read the list and be like, well, I don't even know what my question would be until I start trying to do it. Yeah, good comments in the document. Great. Well, that shows that you're doing work. And yeah, just like I'm going to start looking before I say, hey, do you know where this thing is? And if you don't, or if you don't respond or whatever, I'm going to keep looking until I find it. You keep doing what you're doing. But what you're struggling with is not that you're not doing a thing, it's that you don't know what the actionable steps are to take. You're trying to figure that out. You are putting a lot of resources into the task. You're just putting it into the theory, into the operation part of the task. So there isn't any, the report isn't getting done. But think about writing a book, right? Like being an author isn't just about typing the words onto the page, it's about coming up with the ideas and the language and the whatever, right? The thinking part of it is a very important part of the task, even though nobody can see any result of that until that gets translated into some action that other people can observe. Again, this is not about you having bad task doing muscles. It's just that you're stuck on the part of the task where you're ideating instead of executing. If you knew exactly what to do, you would be doing it. A week doing things muscles, but I want to make steady progress through the day, but it's hard. So I just do needlework instead because needlework is very operational. One of the reasons that you enjoy needlework is because it is something that you can execute. Yeah, it's actionable, it's operationalized. That is one of the reasons that you enjoy it. That's not the purpose that it serves. The purpose that it serves, as with anything which is enjoyable, is that it replenishes your energy. It is restful. Enjoyment, just like pain is draining, enjoyment is restorative in and of itself. That doesn't mean that you should always do whatever you want. People will kind of straw man this when I say these things where they're like, oh, so I should just do whatever I want all the time. No, there are often reasons that you would be better off not doing something, even though it would be enjoyable in the moment to do. Make steady progress, not observable or actionable. So all you're really doing is that you're judging yourself. What do you mean by make steady progress? Does that mean put output, generate output which is observable by other people, meaning like I am writing in the document that will be the report? If so, then we're back to what I was just saying, where figuring out what it is you're supposed to write or how to find out what you're supposed to write is part of the task. And you're working on that part of the task, which isn't to the part where you write things. You mean that I should be engaged in productive work related tasks the entire time? In that case, we're talking about that's not actually possible. Recently, I could do needlework for 10 hours a day for at least a few weeks, and that's really not conducive to my. I doubt that. I think what you mean is that you could enjoy it in theory, doing it for 10 hours a day for a few weeks. Highly doubt it. And I would like to talk a lot about this, but I'm way over time and should be wrapping up. Uh, Highly doubt it. But even if you could theoretically enjoy it for 10 hours a day for a few weeks, which I really doubt, you would unlikely physically be able to sustain the task 10 hours a day for a few weeks. This is part of what happens when people take something they enjoy and then they work at it, right? Like They'll say, because we like to turn everything into psychological things, they'll say, once it becomes your work, now it's work and now it's no longer fun. Where often really what's happening is that you're taking something that you do when the impulse strikes you, and there are reasons that go into having that impulse strike you sometimes and not others. And now you're attempting to force yourself to do it even when the impulse isn't striking you, which there can be a lot of reason to do that, but it is more difficult. And you're trying to do it a lot. And even if you do enjoy it, I really love my job. I really would, in pure enjoyment, sit and talk to people about this stuff, about therapy, do what I do, talk to people 10 hours a day easily. I would enjoy it. Literally, my voice gives out and I get dehydrated and tired and I get headaches. It is stuff that requires physicality as well. Appreciate you saying I should let you go, but as I tell all my clients and everybody, because I run late with everything all the time, I can go anytime I want. You're not keeping me. You don't need to let me go. I'm in charge of this. If I said I'm going and you said, wait, stop, I could still go anyway. I appreciate you considering that, but I'm enjoying doing what I'm doing. And the other things I'm doing, I'll enjoy too. Head to those things soon. Uh, yeah, the 10 hours a day thing. There's something people will call the shower principle sometimes, or the eureka principle, the famous story of Archimedes trying to figure out, water displacement and how things float and whatever. He can't figure it out, and then he gets into the tub and it overflows and the water spills out, and then something clicks and he understands he solved the problem he's working on, and he's so excited that he jumps out of the bath and runs through the streets naked, shouting, "Eureka! I've got it!" Taking a break from what you're trying to do, when what you're trying to do is solve a problem, the intellectual, the cognitive labor, when what you're trying to do is figure something out and you're stuck, you have to take a break. And I'm using take a break here. It's not the optimal language to use here because I understand that that's going to feel like, well, I'm taking a break. I'm taking too many breaks. I shouldn't take this many breaks. It's not about relaxing and enjoying yourself, although it is. I hate the way that our culture has moralized these things because it's just utilitarian. It's just how things work. If you're trying to walk 500 miles, the optimal way to do that is to walk, 10 hours a day with lots of breaks in between so that you can continue to walk. Trying to walk 50 miles on the first day is inefficient. I'm not just saying like be nice to yourself and enjoy your life more, although there's a reason we enjoy that, right? Like just like pain is a signal that something is a problem, enjoyment is a signal that something is beneficial. But yes, we enjoy pacing ourselves and taking breaks, and these things feel good. But we've only evolved for them to feel good because they are actually beneficial in and of themselves. Uh, so when you're doing needlework, you're doing it for a reason, and you judging yourself for doing it makes it less efficient because enjoyment is restorative. Just we're just gliding over all the details of what exactly is going on here, and let's just accept it the same way that pain is draining, enjoyment is restorative, right? Enjoyment is restorative. If you feel guilty about doing what you're doing, you're enjoying it less, which makes it less restorative, which means it takes longer. Classic example of this is someone coming home from school and thinking I should do my homework right after school, but I can't get myself to, and then I stress out and I'll beat myself up in my head, and eventually I do it at 10 p.m. 9 times out of 10, when I work with somebody that's doing that, and one of the very first things I'll suggest is stop trying to do your homework after school. It's ridiculous. That's like running a marathon and then saying, well, I also need to run 2 more miles before the end of the week. So why don't I do that right away? Like that's not how it works. You space these things out. 9 times out of 10, when they stop trying to get themselves to do it after school, they'll still do it at night, but they'll actually do it earlier rather than doing it at 10. Now they're doing it at 8 because what's happening is that you need to rest and restore the resources that you need in order to be able to do the task. And you restore those resources more efficiently if you allow yourself to enjoy things than if you keep feeling terrible about yourself and forcing yourself to put the needlework away and stare at the screen like that's going to help you. like all that you're writing there. Yes. Act like you'll be here tomorrow. You're trying to do your job under the premise that you will be fired tomorrow, which, maybe that's a realistic fear. I doubt it, but, sometimes it's a reasonable thing to be concerned about. You are not engaging in this job as though it is something you're going to be doing for the next 3 years. You're engaging in this job as though it is something that if you don't get it figured out in the next few weeks, you'll be fired. And that might be true. And if it is true, terribly run organization, because when you engage in a job as though you're going to be fired if you don't figure it out all right now and get it done all right now, it's like trying to walk 50 miles in a day. You can maybe do it, maybe for that first day. Even if you can't, you'll certainly get a lot farther than if you were just walking 10 miles a day. But then day two, you're not going to get very much done at all. Day three, maybe you can do some more. But if you don't rest for several days after that first day, then you're only going to do half a mile each day and then never get back to the point where you can do 10 miles in a day. You're rushing, you're trying to move fast. If that's the way that your organization is run, that's unfortunate for them and for you. But I do know that neurodivergent people, we have a tendency to feel as though, think as though, act as though this is our chance. And if we blow it, people will cut us out, cut us off. We won't get another chance. But we don't make incremental process. We engage in patterns of hyperfocus. I'm doing 50 miles today, then long periods of injury invoked rest. Whether you want to rest or not, you're injured because of how much you just did. I don't know. That might be the right math. If it takes 20 minutes to walk a mile, it would take 170 hours to walk 500 miles. With a week straight of no breaks walking, right? Which you could get, I don't know, maybe 8 straight hours of walking without a break at most before you literally just can't keep going anymore. If your boss, if your supervisor is good at their job, they know that turnover in their employees is incredibly costly for them, both in terms of money, but also their time and their energy. Finding someone for the role is costly. Training somebody for the role is costly. But the most efficient and optimal thing for them to do is for them to treat you like you are a long term employee, which means scaffolding you and supporting you and training you and getting you to operate in a way that you're not burning yourself out. Good supervisors, good managers at this point should know, well, whether they know or not. If you're doing it, if you're doing the job well, you are doing it that way. You're not burning out your employees and needing to replace them. You're not scaring your employees into thinking that they can't come to you with questions so that they just don't complete something or complete it incorrectly because they're too scared to ask you because you've made them scared. In fact, good supervisors know that you're working against the grain here. That even though I want my employees to come to me, they've all worked for a lot of people and been in a culture where it said, you shouldn't go. You should figure this out on your own. You shouldn't bother them. So I actively am chasing them down and encouraging them and asking them and checking in on them. Again, organizations are structured different ways. Sometimes supervisors have so many other things on their plate that the actual task of supervision they don't have much room and schedule for. And again, that just sucks. That's But yeah, try to do something complex. Your difficulty in doing that thing has nothing to do with weak doing stuff muscles. It's that complex tasks are difficult to learn as a subset of being difficult to accomplish. Learning how to do it, figuring out how to do it is a difficult part of doing it in addition to the actual execution. And you're on the learning and figuring out part of it, which means you're not executing on things. But there is no skipping that. There's no way for a person to be that just means that they can know how to do a complex task without having to learn it. I agree. Supervisors don't generally become supervisors because they're good at supervising. This is something I advocate for, and I've even started developing a book for because it's beneficial for organizations as well as individuals that leadership being treated as a hierarchical one up position, meaning you're better, you get rewarded more, compensated more, and therefore everybody wants to be in leadership. You have more say in whatever. It means the Peter principle, you rise to the level of your failure or whatever. It means that you take your best programmer and make them spend a bunch of their time doing leadership tasks, which is not programming. It's an efficient way to run an organization. Being a leader and a supervisor should not be elevated hierarchically. It should be treated as what it is. It's a specialty, and it's a specialty involving communication. That your job is communicating with people, and it should be leading from the center, not from the top or from the front or from the back. That if there are 100 people in our organization, each person can't have a detailed relationship and a lot of communication with each of the other 99 because that takes your entire work week. But if we have three people who spend their entire work week having detailed relationships and communications with the other 97, then each of the other 97 only need to know those three and maybe, whatever other ones they directly interact with every day. So people who are in leadership positions shouldn't be doing other things than leadership depending on the scale of the organization. It takes a lot to do it well. And I'm not talking out of my I'm on the stream. I'm forgetting. I run an organization. I started my own practice. We're doing very well. We're growing fast. I have great, brilliant staff who are all wonderful, and we're growing. We're doing well. We're expanding. And I have six full-time staff and three part-time staff. I already am dedicating probably 70% of my energy at work to supervision. I've already selected someone to take over in that role and have started training and scaffolding them to take over in the role of supervising because at six full-time and three part-time staff, I don't have resources to do really anything but supervision and then like 5 hours of sessions to 8 hours of sessions a week. Yeah, public is I do remember that sometimes. When what you're doing is intellectual labor. Some people in the productivity industry will refer to this as the lion schedule. They reference the male lion because everybody will famously talk about, oh, the female lions, all the hunting and everything. The male lion sleeps 24 hours a day because it's different than what people would expect in our culture. Because in our culture, we equate power with activity. But it's actually the opposite. It's not just a funny story about male lions that are lazy. That's not how evolution and biology works. That some organisms just luckily land with their, as my wife's family would say, land with their butt in the butter and get everything done on their behalf. No, the male lion is, we talk about lions a lot for a reason. It is legitimately one of the most pound for pound powerful organisms on the planet. Yeah, landing with your butt in the butter. It's kind of like being born with a silver spoon. You just means you're in a nice, easy situation. Um, a male lion can run faster than most other organisms and hit harder and is tougher. The trade-off, there's a reason that not every organism is that fast and strong and tough. It's a very difficult thing to maintain. In order for it to be able to do that for the hour a day it does that, it needs to spend the other 24 hours of the day resting. Humans are similar. We think, we utilize cognition, not in any, as far as I can tell anyway, theoretically, not in any categorically distinct ways from all other organisms, but we certainly do it more efficiently, more powerfully, with more nuance, more complexity, et cetera, than any other organism. And it's not just there's a there's a cost to that, right? If if that was as beneficial as it obviously is, we are the dominant species on this planet. If that was as beneficial as it obviously is with no downside, then all species would be evolving in that direction at all times. There are trade-offs. The trade-off is that just like with the more complex a piece of machinery is, the more delicate it is, and the more resource intensive it is. We are very complex pieces of machinery. And yes, the more we emphasize the cognition, the more delicate and resource intensive we become. We become able to handle even more and more complex tasks. Look at anyone you would consider to be a genius. And if you look into how they ran their days, the vast majority of the time, you'll find, well, they had very particular, like they needed it to be this way and that way, and they ran their routine in this way and their environment this way. They're very particular. Operate at optimal capacity requires very specific environmental conditions. There is not, in our culture, we have this general belief that cognition does not follow the laws of the universe. It breaks the physical laws of the universe. That if you're walking and you can no longer walk, well, yes, you can if you just think about it right. If you want it. That if you don't have the information to solve a problem, no, you can if you just think about it hard enough. That's not how it works. There are limits, there are costs. We can pretend that there aren't, and you can operate as though there aren't, but it doesn't work. It works to get really big bursts of value over a very short period of time and then no more value, which is why a lot of what these organizations are structured in that way, where they bring in people, they get a lot of valuable labor out of them over a short period of time, and then those people are burned out. They leave for a better job elsewhere, or they get fired, or they quit, or they literally die. Ooh, perfect. I do gotta get wrapping up, but this is perfect. I found I work a lot better in a day if I was productive the previous day, which means if I'm not very productive one day, I spiral pretty fast. Why would that be? Following the physical laws of the universe, why would that be? Right? That being productive one day helps you be productive the next day. If you're going to talk about momentum, well, there's still big breaks in between the productivity one day and the next day. So we're stretching exactly what that word means, and it doesn't mean you can't take big breaks and rest. Either because the thing that enabled you to be productive the one day is continuing to enable you to be productive the following day. And so this is just a correlation rather than a causation, which is probably a big part of it. Or because when you feel as though you haven't been productive, you don't recover energy. If you walk 10 miles in a day, then the next day you're okay with walking 10 miles again and stopping. And the next day you're okay with walking 10 miles again and stopping. If you walk 0 miles in a day, the next day you try to make up for that by walking 20 miles. Well, now you think you should be able to walk 20 miles in a day because you just did it. So if the next day you only walk 10, now you're saying, well, I don't know why I'm being so lazy and struggling. I can walk 20 miles in a day. But then you aren't satisfied with 10. You push yourself to walk more and you try to walk 20 and you burn yourself out. Being productive is not the only way to get energy. Obviously, for example, sleeping and eating food give you energy. But I'm saying enjoyment gives you energy. The things that you do that are enjoyable are not distractions. They are not flaws. They are not you being lazy. Enjoyment, think about doing things you enjoy the same way you think about eating food. It is not optional. It is not. Don't do it, you will fail. As a biological entity, you will fail to function. You will eventually die. It is not optional. Now, can you extend it, go a longer period of time without doing it? Yes, but every moment you do that, the efficiency with which you function decreases. You get angrier and more irritable, and it's harder to focus, and you get brain foggy. This is without eating, right? But it's also without doing things which are enjoyable to you. It's also without sleeping. It's all of the things, all of those are symptoms of being depleted, and doing things which are enjoyable to you is one of the categories of things that restores energy, a certain type of energy to you. Being productive does give you energy because being productive is what we would call eudaimonic enjoyment. You enjoy the fact that you were productive. It means something to you. It gets you closer to a goal. It makes you feel good about yourself. That is restorative. But there are also enjoyment that isn't productive. You enjoy playing D&D. You enjoy eating food that you enjoy eating. You enjoy, I don't know, taking walks, taking a bath, cuddling with your cat, whatever things you enjoy, needlework. But if you treat those things as though they diminish your ability to be productive, then that's how you spiral. The reason you weren't productive on a day you weren't productive is because you didn't have the resources necessary to be productive. Not because you didn't want it, you did. You feel bad about the fact that you weren't productive. You wanted it. You were unable to do it, which means you either needed tools and resources external to yourself that you didn't have access to, including information about how to do the thing, or you didn't have the internal resources, the energy to be able to do the thing. You're already depleted. Now you're upset at yourself and not allowing yourself to do the things which would replenish the energy and allow you to get going. But that's how it spirals. There isn't anything magic about being productive that enables you to be more productive the next day. You can prove it because what counts as being productive is open to interpretation, right? So there can't be anything intrinsic about a thing which impacts you in that way because whether you think of it as productive or not is about your opinion and your perception, not about the thing itself. There can't be anything about the thing itself. It must be about your opinion and your perception. If you think of yourself as not being productive enough and respond to that by saying, I need to work harder, you will spiral. It's the equivalent of, well, I tried to do a pull up and I could only get this far, so I should keep forcing myself to try and do pull ups. It will just make it take longer before you can eventually do it. I'm not saying that you should like this. I'm not ever trying to convince people they should like it. Pure utilitarian. This is how it works. You can wish that you didn't have to eat. It doesn't mean you don't. Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. If you were to treat your muscles the way that you're treating the things you're talking about, you would injure yourself. Right? You can't force yourself to do a pull-up if you don't have the muscles. And I understand why it's helpful to you to think of it that way. And that has a lot to do with our culture again and why you need to be able to justify not being able to do a thing. The problem is that what we're talking about, your inability to do the things we're talking about, is about the amount of resources you have, the cost you can pay, right? That you use this same metaphor. If if a person can do a pull-up, right, can do a single pull-up, that doesn't mean they can do a second one. But let's say that there's a person who can do 20 pull-ups. They'll still eventually get to a point where they can't do the 21st because that inability is about resource expenditure. That they've spent the resources they have available to do the pull-ups to the point that they've done 20, and now the as the system is getting used, the muscles in this case, the skeletal muscular system, which is utilized in doing the pull-up, it gets strained and damaged to some extent at a certain point. There's use that doesn't strain and damage you, and then at a certain point it starts to strain and damage. And as it's straining and damage, the system requires a greater use, a greater amount of resources. The efficiency of the system decreases. So you can do, like I can do 5 push-ups, right? Without the fifth push-up is just as easy and efficient as the first. But on the sixth push-up, now it's more effortful and it's a little harder. On the seventh, it's even harder. And the eighth, it's even harder. And eventually get to a point where I can't do any. But then if I rest for 20 minutes and do it again, I can do one or two or three or whatever, right? You restore to some extent resources get replenished. That is different from a person who can't do that first pull-up. Or if we're talking about lifting, you know, curling a weight, I cannot curl 100 pounds no matter how much I am trying to do that with one arm. So It's not about resource expenditure. The system that I have structured is not capable in its current state of doing that, no matter how many resources I put into it. These are two different types of incapability. One is about the system itself, the structure I would utilize in order to do the thing is not structured in such a way that it can accomplish the task no matter how many resources are put toward it. The other inability or incapability is the system is capable of accomplishing this task, but the amount of resources that would be consumed in accomplishing the task are not available for that at this moment. So this you don't have the muscles and can't do it thing, well, sure. And just like muscles, you can develop them. Yes. And that's what you're theorizing about. That's what your initial question was about, right? Like, how do I effectively build the muscles that allow me to do a pull up because I can't do one right now? And you're right. It's small and it's incremental. But what you're identifying as muscles here are not full systems, they're constructs, right? It would be like saying, I don't have the ability to love someone fully and I need to develop that ability. The theory of incremental development is always a valid theory, but that's a construct love. What exactly do we mean by that? That's not something which physically observably exists. It's a label we use validly and importantly and usefully to categorize or describe a set of observed behaviors, but it's a construct. Your opinion matters here. Getting stuff done is a construct. Doing a pull up, we're talking about an observable action. Getting stuff done, what exactly do we mean getting stuff done? Needlework is getting stuff done. So you can't develop the system to get something done. While it is useful to think of it in that way because it makes it so you don't feel so bad, although you do still feel bad. You don't feel it shifts it from feeling bad about not putting in enough effort to feeling bad about not being capable of doing it despite how much effort you put into it, which is better, but you still feel bad. Instead of just dealing with the reality of what it is. It's a whatever particular task is a specific task. You're trying to solve all these things intellectually, and they can't be solved that way. There's like the equivalent of someone saying, my feel happy muscles are weak. How do I develop my feel happy muscles? It's not specific or observable. It's useful language, but doesn't operationalize. Yeah, well, muscles are weak when they're not used, right? That's how muscles work. So if you want your feel happy muscles or your doing tasks muscles to get stronger, you have to utilize them, which takes us right back to the beginning. Well, then how do I feel happy or how do I do the task? Recursive, right? Jim? Yeah. Yes, you do actually have to be happy more often. You do. You want to get better at being happy, you got to be happy more often. You want to be better at being productive, you got to be happy more often. Again, the things you enjoy, not everybody enjoys those things, right? So again, it's not that there's an intrinsic thing about those things that means that they're enjoyable even though they're bad. Enjoyment, like pain, is a signal that tells us that whatever we're doing is beneficial to do. And just like pain, which is the opposite, it's a signal that tells us that whatever we're doing is harmful to do. In both cases, those signals are inaccurate sometimes. Sometimes things hurt, but they're actually beneficial to do. Sometimes things are enjoyable, but they're actually harmful to do. Yes. But most of the time, those are not inaccurate. And even when something painful is beneficial to do, it doesn't override the reason for the pain, right? Like pricking your finger to test your blood sugar when you're diabetic is beneficial to do and it hurts. It's still worth doing. It doesn't mean that puncturing your skin is now a good thing to do. That's still not a good thing to do. It's just worth doing in this case, and you're doing what you can to ameliorate any negative, downsides of it. And same with enjoyment. Sometimes it's not great to be doing needlework for 10 hours. That doesn't mean that you're not getting benefit out of doing it, just like it doesn't mean that pricking your finger isn't damaging you. You are, but it just might not be worth doing compared to whatever it's costing you to do in that. You want to know what your productivity actually correlates to? Is your happiness. The reason that being productive one day leads to you being productive the next day is because if you're productive on one day, you feel better about yourself, right? You feel happier. And that feeling better, that being happier, it allows you to engage with the things that you enjoy. It allows you to go to sleep and eat food without trying to stop yourself, feeling guilty and trying to push yourself. And then the next day you can be productive again. Look, you have to be happy to be productive. What happens when people are as depressed as it is possible to get? They can barely get out of bed or not at all get out of bed, right? You just like eating, you do need to do things which are enjoyable in order to be able to continue to function. And what's happened with, in this case, but a lot of people in our culture, is that we flip that around and think you need to be productive in order to be happy. You don't. You do need to be happy in order to be productive. You don't have to be productive in order to be happy. But humans do have this ability to create connections utilizing language and cognition that then get encoded and treated as though they are real. When you have a panic attack about someone's coming over to your house and it's not clean, that panic response is a biological response to a near death or an imminent death experience. Literally adrenaline dumping into your system to enable you to escape from something that's going to kill you or fight off something that's going to kill you. We have this uncanny ability to make ourselves, including our actual physical bodies, respond to things as though they are something that we have connected them to. We can respond to something as though it is deadly, even if it actually isn't. So, if you are convinced, as most of us are, that you do need to be productive in order to be happy, then it does become true. You do at that point need to be happy or need to be productive to feel happy. You won't be happy if you feel as though you haven't been productive. But that's how the spiral happens. Because even if you make that connection, you can't override the initial ones. Like you can make your body respond to something as though it's deadly, even though it isn't. You can't make your body respond to something as though it isn't deadly, even though it is, right? You can believe all you want that you don't need food. You will eventually starve and die. So whether you think you need the enjoyment in order to be productive or not, you do, but you only need productivity to be happy if that's something that you've believed. And that's fine. I'm not trying to like tell everyone that we need to just wake up and see reality for it. There are reasons we want to be productive. Productive is another label. We apply it to things for reasons. They're good things to do, generally speaking, but sometimes it glitches out and it gets applied in ways that don't help us. Panicking is, generally speaking, a helpful thing to be able to do, right? Like we have that ability for a reason. We have adrenaline for a reason. But when it gets used in unhelpful ways, implemented in unhelpful ways, it causes a problem. So I'm not saying it's not important to be productive. It is. I'm saying you can't do it if you don't do the things necessary to be able to function. And enjoying things is one of those things. Someday, let's talk about combination of my personal theories and research and logic and evidence of the details of why that is. But for now, just treat it like enjoyment is food. You have to have it. It is not optional. You can defer it. The longer you defer it, the worse things get. Being productive will make you happy and then lead into being productive the next day. But there are other ways to be happy. When you're struggling to be productive, even though you want to be, that means that you're too depleted. You have to use the other ways of being happy in order to get replenished to the point that you can be productive again. Yeah, don't use a task list because even though you have to eat food and you can say, I know you're joking, but even though you have to eat food and you can then say, well, no, it's a task I have to do and I'm going to avoid it. Well, you can avoid it all you want. Sooner or later, you're going to do it. No matter how much you're trying to avoid it, at a certain point, you're not going to be trying to avoid it anymore. Happiness is the same. with neurodivergent people, especially, but not exclusively, you see this pattern play out. They push themselves. They're in a job that doesn't suit them well, and they push themselves, and it's miserable, and they're burning out, and then eventually they blow it all up, right? Rather than repairing, hurting themselves and trying to shift a relationship to make it more sustainable, they just they tolerate it and tolerate it and tolerate it until they can't, and then they blow it up. You're brilliant until you drop out. You get straight A's until it's straight F's. You're the star employee until you can't show up to work for 2 weeks straight. You have friends and things that you do until you just decide to move to another city and start all over. Revenge bedtime procrastination is one popular phrase to explain why they're struggling to fall asleep. Yes. Anyway, I got to get going. Well, I'm choosing to get going. Other things to do with my time, even though I enjoy this. There's a book, Laziness Does Not Exist by Dr. Devin Price, and I have not read the book, although I own it. I just don't really read books that way. But I read the original internet blog article that it was uh, based on, and it was brilliant. So I recommend the book, even though I haven't read it. I think it's probably just as great as that article was. The important thing about that concept, laziness does not exist, is not to say that the word isn't usable. It is. The word lazy is just a word we use to explain why a person doesn't do something that they intend to do. If they're supposed to do something and they don't, well, we can define that as being lazy. If they're supposed to do something and they do it, we call that being motivated. All other variables can be the same. That's all that matters. Do the thing you're supposed to do, you're motivated. Don't do it, you're lazy. So it's a word that's usable to describe that. The problem is that it gets used to explain why the person didn't do it because they're lazy. That can't be. Again, that's recursive. The reason that you didn't do the thing is because you didn't do the thing. Being lazy is something which is only true because you didn't do the thing. Had you done it, you'd be called motivated. So you didn't do it, so we can call you lazy. And that's why you didn't do it. That's not how it works. So when Dr. Price is making the point that laziness does not exist, the point isn't that the language is useless. The point is that when you use it as an answer to the question, why didn't I do it? It doesn't actually answer that question, but it feels like an answer to the question. So it cuts off further exploration into what actually caused you to not do the thing that you wanted to do. And that's a lot of what we're talking about here. Talking about weak doing things muscles and whatever is a perfectly valid and useful way to talk about things. But because it doesn't actually allow you to do anything to solve the problem, but it does feel like an answer, it cuts off further exploration. Now, every time you're struggling, you say, I'm struggling because I'm bad at doing stuff. The only reason we can say you're bad at doing stuff is because you're not doing the thing. So it can't be the reason. The label, which can only be applied accurately based on a certain sequence or event or whatever happening, can never be the reason that the sequence or the event happened. But if you treat it like it is, I'm bad at doing stuff because I'm bad at doing stuff, then it stops you from looking at, well, what's actually happening that is blocking me from being able to do this thing that I'm intending to do. As a general rule of thumb, if you feel bad about not doing something, you care about doing it. You want to do it. So if you feel bad about not doing something and then you say, I just don't want to do it or care about it enough or I need to try harder. Nope. The things you don't care about are not things you feel bad about. They're things you don't think about at all. There are other reasons and energy that we focused on, resources, tools, information, whatever. There are reasons, and there are constrained categories of reasons. If you intend to do a thing, want to do a thing, find it valuable to do a thing, and are not doing it, it is because in some version, in some way, you can't. That could be like we talked about, the system that you have is not capable of doing the thing regardless of how many resources are put into it. It could be that the system you have is capable of doing the thing, but you don't have enough resources to put into it. the system would need to expend in order to do it. It can be that your system and your resources are fine, but it requires some external tool that you don't have or some external resource that you don't have. It could be that you need information like how to do the thing or what exactly to do that you don't have. But it falls under one of those categories. Your system isn't capable of it regardless of resource expenditure. You don't have enough resources, or you don't have enough information or tools or external resources. One of those three, nigh infinite variation under those categories. But it is never, ever, ever, ever a lack of desire. Yeah, it is an accurate metaphor. Metaphors are, I mean, no metaphor could be, if we're using accurate to define like maps the reality exactly, then no metaphor is accurate. That's the point of metaphor. It's metaphors are always a Venn diagram, right? That some element of the thing you're using in the metaphor overlaps with some element of the thing you are attempting to describe using the metaphor, but not the entirety of the metaphor. Like saying it's like learning to ride a bike doesn't mean that that task involves sitting on a bike and putting your feet on pedals, right? Like there's some element of it. So it's a completely accurate metaphor, and it is a useful one. All models are wrong, some are useful. Yeah, it's an accurate metaphor, and it is a useful one for the particular reason you're saying there. It helps you internalize the need to practice, but it doesn't help you to actually design what that practice should look like, or help you to identify what specific thing is happening that's preventing you from accomplishing something in a given instance. So accurate, useful, limited. The hammer is a wonderful tool. It is. You can nail things in with a hammer that you can't do without, with your bare hands. But we don't have to say that the hammer is a useless tool. If you're trying to use the hammer to cut a piece of wood in half, it's a terrible tool for that. And you will likely hurt yourself or damage like you will not accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, and it's not going to go well. That doesn't mean the hammer's a bad tool. It just means don't use that tool for that task. Good metaphor. Don't use the metaphor to try and figure out what you should do. I gotta go. My son just woke up. Good to be with you. Happy New Year. Talk to you all later next week. Bye.